Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you doing today, Patrick? I see you have a...
Top of the morning.
Top of the morning. You have got a black eye. How did that happen?
How did I get my black eye?
Yeah, I've been meaning to ask you since I saw you back.
Okay, well, you know, my full name is Patrick Michael Xavier O'Byrne. And I'm in Ireland, so they can probably all fill in the blanks.
Okay. So we're here today talking about that phenomena where we're seeing $3 billion today sitting in crypto, but really $3 trillion available. And we wanted to explore the what we'll call the transition to Wall Street 2.0, and certainly the role that you've had in this. Just to start this off, Wired Magazine called you the Bitcoin Messiah, and I know you're going to the Holy Land soon, which is another conversation. But exactly how did that happen? What did you do for them to call you the Bitcoin Messiah?
Well, this seems to fall in. Okay, this seems to fall in. I'm going to have to hold this. Well, they called me the Bitcoin Messiah because in 2000 and thank you so much. Because in 2013, the largest company in the world taking Bitcoin was an $800,000 a year diner in Australia. And we stepped up and we were 1.3 billion and started taking Bitcoin. So for that reason, we got known within the Bitcoin world. And
so from 2014 to now, seems to be a lot of change. That everything's gone mainstream. What has happened that you expected, and what is really taking you by surprise?
Well, what took me by surprise, to be honest, was the whole, and I know we have different feelings about this, but the whole ICO thing. Because what we were doing since about 2014 was building a blockchain version of Wall Street among 12 blockchain subsidiaries and investments, a blockchain Wall Street, of which the advantages are going to be huge. And we got the first blockchain private security in the world done 2015, a bond, legal. And then we applied to the SEC to get a blockchain public security done, and we got it done about 17 months ago. And public, it's out there, and it's called OSTKP. And we did that thinking, okay, then the next step is going to be to do it in mass, which would be security tokens. And then last year, it seemed to me the industry took a big diversion into the world of utility tokens and ICOs. And I know that some of those are legal, and I know that you've had your hand in the most credible of them. But in general, call me old-fashioned, I think if you're raising capital from the public to build a business, you're selling a security. And I think that there were a lot of sort of logistical pretzels created around these utility tokens to get around that fact. I was kind of surprised it took the SEC as long as it did to act. But anyway, so to me, last year was a bit of an aberration, the whole move into utility tokens, because I think that what we now call security tokens are clearly the sort of legally conservative way to go forward. Now, I know you differ, and you've had a big hand in the ICO where I don't mean this, and I know that you did some very legitimate ones, you and your partner, Jeff. I mean, you and Steve. So, but I don't mean to slag on the ICOs, but we didn't get involved in any of them, and we like security tokens.
I happen to like security tokens, too. And in fact, we were involved in helping construct the T0 ICO.
Alchemist has been a great help in helping us design and construct and bring to market our own security token. Would you like this?
Yeah, I'd like to if I could. So from an industry perspective, so I come out of this totally different because I spent the past 20 years or so helping disrupt the telecommunications industry. And my involvement has been, as an outsider looking in. And for me, what we have in front of us is a new wave of disruption, something which history will prove us whether right or wrong. But I believe that the next 5 years of change in the capital markets will define the next century of what happens. And on one hand, I believe that blockchain in general is one of the most overhyped, misunderstood technologies in the history of mankind. On the other hand, I believe it's a $4 quadrillion opportunity to understand this. And back in 1995, when I got involved with Voice over IP, we only had 16 million people on the internet. So as much hype as we wanted, it only went so far. These days, with the internet that connects 3 billion, a little word goes out and gets amplified and misunderstood so much. And so we're talking about the change of Wall Street, but I do think we're seeing a revolutionary change in access to funds, opportunities for people anywhere in the world, finally, if they have an idea, to get funded. The idea that 20 years ago, when the internet was happening, people were saying that you could live in a third world country and make change. Now I actually think you can, and I think the financial inclusion can happen due to the infrastructures that are happening in place. And so, while I am thinking about ICOs and Wall Street, I am also thinking of access to capital. And so, the idea that any entrepreneur with a dream can, following a procedure which is going to be regulated in their country, gives them easy access, or at least easier access to capital to fulfill a dream, I think is groundbreaking.
Absolutely. For 40 years, economists have been talking about the problem of the unbanked. 90% of the world doesn't have a bank account. And how we're going to solve that, and the way the West has been trying to help the developing world develop, is look at our institutions and you copy them and try to build them yourselves. Well, they can all skip that step now. We have a number of companies, as I mentioned, like we have a blockchain meets capital formation, which is really land governance. We have that company which generates capital. We have in Barbados a company called BIT, which is blockchain meets central banking. And then we have a blockchain capital market, T0. It's going to be possible very soon for people to have all over the world, there's 7.5 billion people on Earth, 5 billion of whom don't live in a world anything like what we understand. They live unregistered, undocumented lives in homes that are not really theirs, or as far as the government's concerned, they're just favelas and stuff like this. It's going to be possible soon for them to have capital and access capital, and through peer-to-peer lending apps, lend that capital, share that capital, save it, do all that kind of stuff without the intermediating institutions we've always needed, frankly.
So what we see is a greenfield opportunity in finance. So when I looked at voice over IP going into countries, it was much easier to deploy high-definition voice in places which had no infrastructure. And so in Moldova, for example, had HD voice way before the United States.
It reminds me of back in the 80s, early 80s, economists used to also speak of how many tens of millions of tons of copper it was going to take to wire up India. So every home in every village had a phone. Then the cell phone comes along, got cheap, and they skipped that whole step. I think that's going to happen with a lot.
I think it's happening in finance. It's going to be, that's why it's like revolutionary. It's there are these technologies of change that happen because of the internet. But I do believe when we look at the future history and how it's going to be written, the impact of blockchain itself across multiple industries, I think financially will be more impactful than the introduction of the internet.
It's funny. I say that, and usually people think I look crazy. You can say that because you've been a part. I think this is much bigger than the internet, and the political ramifications are bigger. The internet really disrupted publishing. It makes it so cheap to move information. Different forms of publishing and broadcasting, but publishing. I've been in a Silicon Valley company where they have a wall of industries they think the blockchain disrupts, and there's 160 institutions, I should say. Some of those institutions are corporate, and some of them are government, depending on what country you're in. But there's 100 or more institutions that are going to be disrupted by blockchain compared to really the internet doing one.
So just a little deep dive into T0 for people here not familiar with what T3, let alone T0 means. What was the inspiration when you were doing Overstock to kind of like change course, or at least let your passion follow through, to create a company like T0? And why is it different than other companies today?
Well, I recognized in 2012, I used to study computation theory at Stanford, did my doctorate there. And so when the blockchain came along and I was first reading about this thing called Bitcoin, I understood, I realized it was based on the math I used to study, and I got interested. And I got very intrigued by really the disruptive potential, the political potential and such. So I really wanted to get into it. And truth is, I was going to do it I thought of doing it outside Overstock. And then I thought, well, I've got these wonderful shareholders who stuck with me through thick and thin. and the Byrne family owns about a third of Overstock anyway. So why not share it with everybody? And I did it within Overstock. Looking back, every day I wonder, should I have just gotten out of Overstock and just focused on this? But it felt like the right thing to do since I was working there and it all. So we used Overstock capital, and Overstock shareholders get to benefit. And we really picked out a few areas that. So you and I both think that there's this sort of new age coming to humanity riding on blockchain. I picked what I think are the most fundamental processes of the new age, which to me are the formation of capital. If you think of it, a tech stack, the formation of capital, formation of money, which in these days means central banking, capital markets, supply, commerce, and voting, because one hopes that this future age of mankind is still one where consent of the governed matters. And those were sort of the 5 areas I wanted to be in. Yeah, I guess you also want to say identity. And so I picked blockchain identity, blockchain land governance, blockchain central banking, blockchain capital markets, blockchain supply chains, and blockchain voting as the areas. And to me, what we are very close to having is, frankly, all of that in a box, central bank in a box. We actually have this at this point, where we could fly into a collapsing country, of which there are many around the world, say to the central bank, here's your new central bank. When you want to issue currency, put it on this blockchain. Everybody in the country just downloads an app, a free app on their phone. And by the way, even though about 10 or 15% of the world has an app, about 140% of the population in less developed countries may have phones, because people have 2 phones. So everyone just downloads an app, and now you have a whole financial system. You can form capital and share capital and pay people and do securities and all these things. But it's basically you have mobile banking but without an underlying bank account, and mobile securities and all that kind of stuff. So it really is that chance for countries to leapfrog the whole let's lay copper wire to every home phase.
So with this just positive disruption, I imagine that certain people in charge might take a certain approach to it. I'm just curious, without getting into too much detail, because I appreciate that a lot of stuff you do is private. How, in general, have regulators been open or not open to change? And to some extent, if you're coming in and disrupting central banking, you'd argue that some regulators might be afraid of losing their jobs, and so they might necessarily be that positive. Is there a frame or sense of, where are the regulators right now thinking about the idea of tokenizing their economy, and how receptive have they been to what you've been suggesting?
I've actually been pleasantly surprised. It hasn't been as quick as it could have been. And the United States, I think, lagged for a couple years versus Europe, and certainly Asia. But they've really, pulled up their socks and gotten to work. I'm very impressed with their understanding at this point, at least in the U.S. government, of blockchain and its revolutionary potential. And they understand they're not going to stop it, and it's too late to stop it. And to be honest, the regulators are not as against it as I thought. I started interacting, let's say, with FINRA and the SEC again a couple years ago after. I'm just curious, who here knows? Raise your hand if you know about another little fisticuffs I got in about 12 years ago with Wall Street. Anyone ever hear of that? Over in U.S., it's well known. About 12 years ago, I got in a big fight with Wall Street because I figured out some things that were going on. And I thought it was my job to expose it. Anyway, so I did not have a good relationship. But then in the last, and I didn't really talk to anybody for about 10 years. About 2 years ago, we started interacting with regulators, and it seems to me there's 2 types. There are, in some places, those who are, if you believe the economist theory of regulatory capture, that means that some regulators are actually working for the industries they're supposed to regulate. And in some countries, not going to name which ones, that is the case. And in those countries, their regulators are dead set against this. But in in countries where there's not so much regulatory capture, And I feel at this point, I never thought I would say this. I'm probably the biggest critic of the SEC, by the way, in America. 10 years ago, I was out there bashing them, so you can take this as sincere, and that I actually am super impressed. I'm very impressed. There's a woman named Valor who just this week got promoted to something or other. She's now their blockchain person. She could walk out of the SEC and work in any blockchain company. They have people there now who actually do understand all this. It's not like a couple years ago where when I talked to regulators in some countries about the blockchain Wall Street and this and all these great things, and it drops transaction costs, you get more liquidity, blah, 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 compute immutability, great regulatory, great benefit for regulators. I get all through the explanation, and regulators would say, yeah, but isn't this Bitcoin thing used for ecstasy dealing? And so you couldn't get anywhere. But now people have gotten much more sophisticated. They know the difference between Bitcoin and blockchain, and they understand a lot more.
So I used to work on Wall Street in the early 90s, and when I worked at Cantor Fitzgerald Securities, we had the New York desk, we had Tokyo, we had London, and we had trading hours. We worked 9 to 5, except on federal holidays. People had positions, world things happened, and then markets moved. In Wall Street 2.0, or whatever this goes into, I believe we're 24/7, always on. How do you think the impact of 24/7, always on trading is going to affect the institutional side, both the buy side and the sell side, where there is no time other than the present and we're always on?
Well, I think it's going to change the lifestyle of a lot of people on Wall Street, and it means that there's always going to be people are always going to have an ear cocked to the news 24 hours a day, and I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if capital gets allocated more efficiently and if there's more or less volatility and all those things. I do worry that if there's overnight, and T0 has opened up overnight trading in America. There's one, and I can say this publicly because it's public. There's one company, TD Ameritrade, who is actually using our system. You can actually now trade stocks in America 24/5, and we actually have running the technology that powers that. It's been live since the Super Bowl. If you remember, in the Super Bowl, there was an all-night-long ad by TD Ameritrade. There are now other people coming to us for the same thing. So it's going to have a big lifestyle change. I don't know what is going to... I worry that in the hours where trading gets very thin, it may create opportunity for bad stuff to occur. When there's various kinds of market manipulation that you really can't do in a thick market because capital rushes in to correct, but maybe in a thin market you can. And so I'm just kind of curious to see what happens. What do you think on that question?
I think we're going to see change. And I do think we're going to actually find time for the entire world to relax and to breathe and catch up. I think world events might actually give us a chance to actually learn to be present. And we're going to have a chance, because things will happen that we need to just take a breath. And so while we were 24/7 trading works most of the time, all of us need a chance to actually be present also. And I think that there's going to be a moment where we actually find balance, and that it's going to work across the world, and that perhaps we'll actually find that inner peace.
From your lips to God's ears.
So I hope. Well, listen, I appreciate the audience for listening to us. That's Patrick Byrne. I'm Jeff Pulver. We're available via Twitter. We're on the app inside if you have questions. We have a limited amount of time, so we're going to leave. We thank you for your attention, and we hope you have a great conference. Thank you very much.